So, you know, there's empty desks like this in schools all over Europe, actually. Empty desks that shouldn't be empty. And also in schools there are desks where there are children there at times and they're psychologically absent. They may be physically present, but they're actually gone. They've opted out of that system. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clare. I'm Irish, and I'm actually really pleased to be here this afternoon to speak to you in relation to reducing early school leaving. I'm going to speak to you in a capacity of roles this afternoon. I'm going to speak to you as a mother, as a parent, as a teacher, school principal, and I'm also reporting to you from the Working Group on School Policy. And the report on that will be out in November and presents a really good toolkit as well for schools. Yes, I'm actually going to talk about school because I love school. I'm a teacher. I'm going to talk about the power of school. I'm going to talk about the value of school. And sadly, I'm also going to talk about the converse, where that process of disengagement actually has such a detrimental effect on young people, on the individual, on the family, on school, on the community, and in fact, ultimately, on society. I'm also going to talk about three major players that have such an impact on the progress and the prospects of children. And they are namely parents, teachers, and school leaders. I suppose from the parent perspective to begin with, I am a school principal. I'm a principal of an all-girls Catholic school in Ireland, actually about 1,000 girls, lots and lots of hormones actually. And I just love school. And I've always been involved in education. I've never left school really since I've been 3, I suppose, when you think of it like that. And I've been involved particularly in the area of educational disadvantage and socioeconomic disadvantage. And I've always had a leaning and a propensity towards those schools and towards, like you said a moment ago, those kind of broken boxes or broken fences. I suppose professionally also I've worked at national level and I had the great privilege of representing Ireland for 3 years on one of the thematic working groups on early school leaving. And I learned so much in that, in sharing practice. But equally I think I brought something powerful to that group as well. I brought the practical aspect of being in a school day in and day out. And that's really, really important because sometimes policymakers and decision makers can lose sight of the real issue, the real children, the real school, the real routines of school life. I suppose on a personal level, I'm also really interested in educational disadvantage. I'm from a very large family. I'm one of 13 children. I have 7 sisters and I have 5 brothers. And the reason I'm standing here this afternoon is because my mother believed completely, totally and utterly in education. She did everything in her power to make sure that the 13 of us remained in education, benefited from it and moved on to bigger and better things. And that's precisely what happened actually. Not because of our innate ability or capacity or capability, because my parents invested their entire lives in education. And I made a promise when I was appointed principal 15 years ago that I'd make sure that no obstacle would remain in a school that would prevent a child from actually benefiting from education. And that is really, really important. In terms of parents, parents are co-educators. And it is our job, I suppose, in society to look at many, many ways of involving them as partners in their children's education so that they can become resources for their children, enduring resources into the future. In Ireland, one of the schemes that has made an incredible difference is the Homeschool Community Liaison Scheme, where teachers are directly deployed to work with parents so that their children benefit within school. And having done that for 5 years as a teacher, it's amazing the perspective you get. It's amazing the insights you get when you're sitting in someone's kitchen. And I can say this to you without question, invariably, I have never met a parent who doesn't want the best for their child. It mightn't be your best, it mightn't be my best, but it's their best. And our absolute imperative is to continue to empower them, to enable them, to build their capacity as parents and as co-educators and model the way forward for them. I suppose I need to convince you further if this is an important topic when you keep looking at this empty desk. We've heard some of the statistics this morning, or this afternoon I should say. But to continue, the reduction of the early school leaving, we know that to less than 10% of the relevant population is one of the headline targets in the 2020 strategy. There's no doubt about that. We know that 11% of 18 to 24-year-olds have left education without completing upper secondary education. And we know the consequences of that. The story is written already. The conclusion is there. We know that we've huge youth unemployment in Europe. 21%. And what that actually translates into is that we have 7.5 million young people between the ages of 18 and 22 who are either unemployed or who are not involved in education or training. So is this an important topic? Absolutely. And if you look at all of the words that are to do with early school leaving, I think they paint that picture of what it actually looks like. Words that have just been used already in the opening words. All of these words really give you the sense, whether it's around unemployment, whether it's around disconnection, social exclusion, poor health, poor well-being, isolation. All of those words come together and paint that picture of real people and real stories. And as a school principal, I have to add to that, because when I actually personalise young people, I just think of the loss of potential, the loss to society. I think of the waste. I think of the loneliness, because many of those children have no connection whatsoever to anyone or anything in that school building. I think of the huge cost in terms of health, in terms of well-being, but also financially, because, mark my words, we will be picking up the pieces for decades to come in terms of early school leaving. And I also think of poverty, because really it is about poverty. And I'm reminded of Pfeiffer's cartoon back in the 60s, and it's as relevant today as it was then. And it's worth reading. I used to think I was poor, and then they told me I wasn't poor, I was needy. And then they told me it was self-defeating to think of myself as needy, I was deprived. And then they told me deprived was a bad image, I was actually underprivileged. And then they told me underprivileged was overused, I was disadvantaged. I still don't have a penny, but I have a fantastic vocabulary. And there's great learning in that for ourselves. We can use all of the words and all of the language, but behind all of that, you're talking about real people, real children, real lives, real stories, real homes. And it actually is about poverty, actually. And when I think of poverty, of course the material poverty is really dreadful. But more appalling and more damaging into the future is that poverty of expectation, that poverty of ambition, that poverty of hope. The working group on school policy looks at that whole notion of moving best practice to next practice, practice that is transferable and applicable across the systems. I want us this afternoon to really have a conversation within this room here. So whatever guise you're in, whatever role you represent, whether you're a teacher, a youth worker, a policymaker, a civil servant, a parent, it doesn't really matter. Every single one of us in this room has a part to play in this drama. Schools can't do it on their own. Families can't do it on their own. And certainly students who are challenged day in, day out, certainly they can't do it on their own. And it behoves each one of us to move in there and to intervene and to make a difference, either individually and collectively. Those are the 5 areas that have been identified by the working group in terms of making a real difference, particularly in terms of a whole school approach, a whole community approach to making a difference. And that's embedded in an overarching vision, which is inclusive, an inclusive strategy and vision for education. The 5 areas have been mentioned. I'm mentioning the 3. I've already talked about parents, and I'm going to move on to your favourite topic. Everybody loves talking about teachers. But you know, it's an interesting thing about teaching. Again, we're aware of lots and lots of bits and pieces. We know in classrooms and schools and corridors and yards all over Europe, there are practices that enhance learning and outcomes, and there's also practices that exacerbate that. So, for example, when we look at differentiation, what we mean by that is that we need to look at the child in front of us, and we need to make the curriculum and learning accessible to that child, and that's about differentiation. We know in terms of teachers, the classroom practice and their attitudes to the children in front of them is critically important. We know that they must have the highest expectations for the children in their care. And also that they would foster and build really warm, safe, caring relationships so that those children have a connection to those adults in those schools. And of course we talk about the school culture, which must be warm and safe and inclusive and welcoming. But the thing about teachers is that it's interesting that everybody thinks they know everything about school. Everyone thinks they're an expert on school and on teachers because you've all been to school. But actually it's very, very different. I am so proud of being a teacher. But I'm often reminded of Harper Lee's words, and Atticus Finch, he says to his daughter, he says at the end, he says, until you climb into someone's skin and walking around in it, you really don't have a concept or an understanding of where people are. So whether you're a student or a teacher, I would ask you to do that. In terms of teaching, we know the huge power that teachers have to make such a difference to children. And as I said to you, I am so proud of being a teacher. I think it's a noble, noble profession. In fact, Michael Fullen puts it beautifully. He says there are few professions other than teaching where gaining personal meaning through improving the lives of others for years and even generations to come is so palpable and so profound. And that's a powerful quotation. And you know, when I work with teachers, it can go either way. That's what's so important. What's so important is that we need to work and to assist and to support teachers hugely, particularly when we're talking about early school leaving. Because I have to say also that when we work with those students, they are often the most challenging, the most difficult, the most needy. And I have worked in that school where you're dealing with poor behavior, where you're dealing with cynicism, you're dealing with apathy. And you work so hard as a teacher and you have so little to show for it. And that can be soul destroying. And I would say that to you in your workshops tomorrow. How do we sustain those adults and those professionals in the school? Because, you know, sometimes it can be like that, actually, for both the child and for the adult. And maybe you kind of have to ask yourselves in this audience, which one are you? Are you pushing or are you being pushed? And I suppose that's the question for all of us. And when I look at those children around early school leaving, the teachers we need are the most committed, the most dedicated, the most passionate, the most energetic, the children who really want to work with those students. And in order to foster those and develop those and nurture them, we have to look at school leadership, because that's so, so important. We need school leaders who love their children and who love subjects and who love what they do and love what they teach. Dean Fink again puts it beautifully. He said, schools for tomorrow will require leaders who are passionately, obsessively, creatively and steadfastly committed to enhancing students' learning. We know how important school leadership is. And again, we have to ask the question, how do we sustain those people? Because against all the odds, they are there fighting for those children. We know that effective school leadership is absolutely critical. We know that school leadership is second only to classroom instruction in terms of the outcomes on children's learning. And that's an amazing fact. In terms of the school leaders, we need leaders who will support and reflect the value, the primal value, that the child matters, that every child matters. And in fact, that you matter. That you matter so much that we will do everything as a school to work for you, to keep you sitting in this seat. We will invest in you. We will develop you, we'll adapt our curricula, we will differentiate. We'll use different methodologies, we'll listen to you. We will pursue you relentlessly. We'll work with your family. And we'll be demanding of them that they take their responsibilities seriously. But you know what? We're actually going to support them too. And we're going to do that because we want you to hold your head up high and just be like anybody else and be as powerful and as brilliant as every child in this school. And we do it, you know why we do it? We do it because we care. And in schools, care matters so, so much. It's all about care, actually. It's all about relationships at the end of the day. And what I would say to you, I suppose when I began this conversation, and we talk about school leaders, and we talk about schools, and we talk about teachers, I would ask you also, in your capacities, how can we support schools to be innovative, to be creative? Because that's what we also need. We need schools that can go out there and take risks and do things a little bit differently. Because if we keep doing what we've always done, we keep getting the results we always got. And it hasn't been working to date. That's so important that you would do that. I began our conversation today talking to you that I'm from Ireland. And we're renowned for lots of things. Until yesterday we were decimated by Argentina. Sure, look it. We'll get over it. We'll be all right. But Ireland is renowned for a number of things. One of them was rugby. No, we will be rugby again. We'll do that. We're also renowned for our beautiful landscape, the Cliffs of Moher. We have a good sense of humour. We have to with the economy we have. We're renowned for literature. Leprechauns. Everybody recognises Guinness. And Aran jumpers. And we're also renowned for something else as well. We're renowned for music and for dancing. And you know, Irish dancing is a very particular type of dancing. And in the 40s, 50s, 30s, and so on and so forth, Irish dancing is a very particular form of dancing. And when you look at it, it isn't that fierce exciting, but I just want you to look at it for a moment. Yes, it's very skillful. But it's not very exciting. It's not very inspiring. And you know, like the Beatles did, they took a song and they made it better. And what happened was we had someone who came along and thought a little bit differently. And his thinking came outside the box and took dancing and actually reconstructed and recrafted it to make it better. That's what we need to do in education. Same legs, a bit of music. It's actually rethinking, going outside of the box, doing things differently and doing it better. A whole school approach. Thank you very much.